Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Indie Reads Aloud. We are having so much fun in this program. I don't know about you guys, but I love it when people read out loud to me. And my author circle keeps growing every day. I get to meet new authors and I get to hear more stories. And to my tremendous delight, I'm finding that some of my favorite authors write more than one book. And that is the case with M Samland. This is Jamie, and he is here tonight to read for us again. He's already been here, but he's back. And he has a new book, and it's called Grave Mistakes. It is a dark fantasy comedy wonder thing. So I'm super, super excited because it is a brand new book, and I love being on the edge of a new release. So thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
So those of you who haven't met Jamie yet, he is a fantasy author based in Canton, Michigan. He is passionate about creating vivid worlds and compelling characters that transport readers to new realms of imagination. Drawing inspiration from his love of storytelling, Jamie spends his free time playing board games, role playing with friends, and indulging in other hobbies like, martial arts and home repair. So if your house decides that it's going to revolt, he'll beat it into submission. That's how that works. When he is not writing, Jamie is often found lost in thought, dreaming up new and exciting stories to share with his readers alongside his husband and their cats. Welcome back again. I'm so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
I love doing our author events together, and when we get to be at Sweetwater's and we get to share work with the public, it's so much fun. But this opportunity to have you just read for me, because I'm nothing if not a selfish 6-year-old, I love this. This is fantastic. Well,
just reading to you and whoever else might be listening right
now. Yeah, whoever's eavesdropping, that's fine. I would do this program even if nobody ever listened, just so that I could have people read to me. Tell me about Grave Mistakes. Where did you get the idea to write this story?
So years ago, before I put out my first book, Realms of Turfwood, my husband and I would be taking long trips, and we would just think about like story ideas. I've always liked to write, but it wasn't until the COVID-19 lockdown that I had the actual time to do it. So before then, we'd be going on long trips, and we would be thinking about like what other stories would be great ideas that would probably sell a million copies. And we thought of like the Twilight stories, and girl falls in love with a sparkle fairy or a were llama or whatever. But
were llama,
were llama, yes.
That's just great.
What if she ends up falling in love with a ghost? So this was an idea that we had, where girl meets boy, boy dies, and then boy has to be re-alived in order to continue the story. So that was going to be my first book, and then I said, "Yeah, I'm not ready for this yet." And then when I started writing my last novel that came out last March, Canton, I was starting to write this, but I said, no, I want to write a story about a shy gay boy that finds his first love. So I wrote that story instead. So I finally said, okay, I'm going to do this. Girl meets boy, boy dies, and then they have to realive him. And so I finally, for the most part, wrote what I intended there. So it just was a long time coming for this one, but I think of all the stories that I've written that I started things back in high school, and these stories that I pick up from what I wrote in high school, they are like, you can't touch what you can do as an adult, having the experience you have as an adult.
Sure.
Those characters. So much richer characters now, and I'm glad to have written this book now rather than my first book, because it's better now than I would have done if I had done it first. So
yeah, well, all things happen in their own time, right?
That's right.
And as creative beings, we have to be sensitive to that indicative timeline that sometimes runs without our influence.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, that's a really cool thing. So this book is really different because it's so wonderfully non-traditional.
Right.
So one of the biggest questions I have is, of all the settings that you wrote for this book, what is your favorite locale that you came up with to drop your characters into?
It probably would be the Crystalwood Gardens, I guess. It's an enormous cemetery, and the world is divided into the world of the living and the Deadvale, and it's the division line is the crack, and the crack lines runs right through the middle of the Crystalwood Gardens, and we see one side of it, the side that's in the Deadvale. All the crypts are all broken open because the dead rose, and they got out of their crypts over on that side. And so we see that, and the main character Gabriela is the whole time wondering, oh, they got up, and I wonder what they did. Like, what kind of fun did they have once they got up from being dead for however long? And she's just kind of wondering what stories they had, and what were they when they were alive. It's just extremely innocent and naive. And then they get to the other side of the crack, and they see the Crystalwood Gardens on that side, and it's still, nature has started to recover, or retake the gardens a bit, but it still is, all of the sarcophagi are still closed up.
Yeah,
all closed up. So having that dual side of it and the main character's reaction to it, and then we have other people that other characters who had fought the dead, the risen dead, within the Crystalwood Gardens, and their reactions to it, and there's going to be death mages here, a lot of worry about what was going to happen when they get to the Crystalwood Gardens. It just sounds like a nice place, at the gardens, right? But it's a giant necropolis in the middle of the world. And a lot of my stories I find do involve a lot of death and like necromancy kind of ideas. And when I was growing up, my parents were huge into genealogy, so I spent a lot of my childhood in graveyards, like in courthouses, looking up birth and death.
Oh, okay. So this explains where your storytelling comes from.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, because you went on field trips
in the cemetery. We're trying to find somebody that had died, 200 years ago, trying to find their tombstone.
Yeah. Yeah, not long ago I read a news story about how in the 1920s picnicking in cemeteries was a thing. Like it was not an unusual thing. It was something that they did quite often.
Absolutely. It was giant tended grounds. You use it, right? You don't just let it go.
Pretty amazing. I'm really excited to hear this brand new story from you. I can't wait. I think it's going to be really cool. So for those of you who may have a gentle aversion to dead things, you might want to skip this episode with the little people, but this is not an offensive episode, so we think that just about anybody can listen in. So Jamie, please, when you are ready, take the microphone and read aloud, please.
Absolutely. So we're going to start with the prologue. If a book has a prologue, please do read it. It is part of the story. I don't know why people skip prologues, but there's a prologue, and we begin. With a final crack that split the deadened air, the hellfire faded from the abomination's sunken eyes. Sir Morningsword fell to his knees, gasping for breath in the fetid chamber, calling for a grace of holy light, proved useless in this place that stank of death and profane magic. With a mumbled prayer to Elisara and the Grand Matriarch, he rose, grasping the handle of his warhammer and wrenching it free of the beast's chest. His weapon broke apart in the motes of brilliant yellows and whites as he released it. He absorbed the power into one gauntleted fist and drew the great sword from his back with the other. What lay at the top of this accursed tower would take every scrap of his strength to vanish. Hefting the blade in both hands, the paladin stepped around the fallen guardian to the iron-banded arch doors beyond. He grunted, channeling his might into his shoulder, pushing against the door, pulling strength from his brothers that would never see their holy mission to an end. Their reward would be eternal, but Sir Morningsword would not let their mortals suffer. Not let another mortal suffer under the yoke of the dead. No more of his order would die holding the numbers at bay. The dread lord of the Deadvale's tyranny would end today. The door gave way on hinges to the macabre throne room. The ceiling of murky stained glass showed hints of the swirling storm with flashes of soundless lightning. Stout iron chandeliers dripped tallow from 100 candles, and ancient, heavy tapestries covered the stone walls. Morningsword saw none of it, focusing on the throne set high on a dais and the one seated upon it. No one had laid eyes on the dread lord's ruler before, at least no one that lived. He expected a warrior, hulking armor, or skeletal mage in resplendent robes. He did not expect the dread lord to be a dread lady. The dark gems of her tall crown caught in the candlelight as she drummed long, thin fingers on the armrest of her throne. She stared at him, her eyes glowing ice blue. "At long last," she said, her voice low and smooth. "I had a worry your matriarch's finest would never produce one that might reach me." The paladin blinked away his initial confusion. Calling to the saints, he took a deep breath, holding his sword's tip pointed firmly at the dread queen. "You have slain untold numbers, fiend, by your hand or by the unholy abominations at your command. I, Sir Oswin Morningsword, first brother of the Order of 6 and 8, shall see your your reign end here today." Her eyes trailed a fine mist of blue as she stood, laced with delicate threads. Her midnight purple gown, oh goodness, I'm sorry. Her eyes trailed a fine mist of blue as she stood, laced with delicate crystal threads. Her midnight purple gown clung to her lithe form to cool at her feet. "I commend you, first brother, and nearly pity that such conviction will come to nothing." She flexed one hand gracefully, in the dark corners of the room glowed with pinpoints of red hellfire. A dozen sets of holy paladin armor, stained and rusted with old blood, shuffled to the light of the tallow candles, unholy light visible through the slits of their helmets. Morningsword instantly recognized two sets of the armor as those worn by his comrades that he entered the tower with days ago, while others spanned centuries of designs for the church's holiest warriors. Morningsword left the forge, accepting without a whisper of doubt that he or some of his band would either slay the dread lord or all would fall in trying. Yet seeing his brothers standing in service to the church's greatest foe, the paladin felt doubt creep into his veins for the first time since taking his vows nearly 20 years ago. The sword dipped an inch, unsure he would raise it again against his brothers, even to save himself, even if it meant slaying the lich. What awful and unknown powers were at her command to allow this truly unholy act? Would he fall to their swords and hammers, only to be raised to stand against the next generation of the Grand Matrix warriors? "They each fought admirably," said the dead queen. She glided down from her dais and circled one paladin wearing tarnished golden armor, wielding a morning sword and tower shield. "Each served their goddess for the final blow. Now they serve me." She traced a nail along the armor's pauldron and strode to stand at the base of her dais with the armored paladins flanking her. "As time means little, I would offer you a moment's rest, collect your thoughts, and speak whatever final prayers may bring you comfort." Morningsword's weapon dipped lower. His arms ached, his legs ready to give out. A lifetime of service to the goddess and grand matriarch led to this moment. Not only his life, but the lives of those surrounding him. Their bodies littered across the tower's lower levels. Hundreds had fought against the dead and failed. All that had led to this moment, all had led to this moment, but just ended up empowering the enemy of their goddess. He would not raise arms. He would not raise arms against his brothers. His great sword clings to the stone floor. His armor, always a symbol of his faith and devotion, now hung heavy across his shoulders. He twisted the locking joints of his left gauntlet and let it fall beside his sword. He reached for the other. "If the goddess and grand matriarch will me to fall and join your ranks, I will do so as a man. I will not give another of my order to the dead." She watched him shake free his right rear brace. "You must understand this makes no difference. Your faith means nothing after the final blow. Your corpse can don your armor just as easily as you strip it." The risen paladins moved one step closer. "They will kill a man, not a paladin." The queen cocked her head and stepped forward, putting icy hands on his, stopping him from removing his helmet. So near, he stared into those frigid eyes and knew immediately, without doubt, that his goddess was not all-powerful. Here was a creature untouched by her grace, devoid of her touch, yet thriving. "You are a fascinating specimen, Sir Oswin Morningsword. Quite fascinating." He stepped back, and the fallen paladins advanced. Chapter 1: A Spoiled Apple. Gabriela held up the spoiled apple, taking in its sharp scent. Others might cringe and gag, but it reminded her of home. She glanced over her shoulder at the packet. No one had noticed the little wave of her hand. She knew she had to undo it. Gabriela called to the powers that responded sluggishly this side of the crack and waggled 2 fingers over the end. Before she could enact her will, the fruit seller turned to her, frowning, extending a hand to Gabriela. "I'll rid that of you. Take 2 on me if you don't tell anyone about it." No, thank you. Gabriela held the mushy apple close and smiled at the vendor. I'll find a bin and toss it for you. As you like. The apple vendor moved to the next client, the exchange already. Gabriela took a few steps away and lifted the apple again, breathing in its fragrance deeply. She glanced back as the clouds parted for a moment, creating a path to the town square and the three riders atop their horses. The lead man, a noble by the shine of his dark, wavy hair, strong jaw, and perfect cut of his wool coat and leather riding gloves, stared directly at her, despite the hundreds of others to stare at. Why is he staring at me? TDC. Gabriela looked down at the spoiled apple in her hands and quickly hid it behind her back to let it roll to the ground. One of the other riders, with longer blonde hair tied back in a strap, said something, momentarily pulling the noble's attention. He looked back to Gabriela once more before nudging his golden palomino into action, and the crowd shifted to fill the space between them. Gabriela wrung her hands and glanced across the shoppers, looking for anyone who might have noticed the exchange, but no one paid her any mind. Keeping her basket of dried herbs and fresh green close in the crook of her elbow, she wove through the crowd, making her way to the town's outskirts. Pulling up the hood of her vermilion riding cloak, she kept her head down, wary that each turn might leave her standing alone in front of that handsome noble with its piercing eyes. She exhaled fully when she finally saw her pony and escort at the crossroads. As she approached, she glanced south to the sheer cliffs overlooking the sea, and north along the well-worn road leading to every other living town in the world. Beyond her pony and guardian, a fourth path could barely be made out amongst the weeds and overgrowth. You look, you took quite a while, Princess, came the hollow voice from the fine suit of leather armor. Much longer, and I might have risked coming in for you. Sorry, Lord Sebastian, said Gabriela, and busied herself with stuffing her purchases into the gelding saddlebags. I couldn't find the Eggleberry. I had to circle the market 4 times before I saw it was at the spice merchant right at the front. I needn't remind you that we should have already been on our way. We won't make it to the inn by nightfall if we don't leave now, or at least very soon to now. Gabriela turned to him with a smirk. Whatever would I do without your timely reminders about things you needn't remind me of? Clever as always, Lord Sebastian gave his single echoing chuckle. Have you seen Aura? No, but she's always around somewhere. She must have been overwhelmed as me in the market. It's not like her to miss a chance to knock over things. Just let me make sure. Gabriela compared her scribbled list beside the contents of the saddlebag. Oh, fish eyes, ice ginger. I looked right at it, and I'll just be a minute. Lord Sebastian creaked and shifted with unease. Now, I really must remind you, Princess, Mum will be furious if we don't return you on schedule. Oh, pish, we both know that we've never seen my mother angry a day in her life. 20 minutes, in and out, and we'll be on our way. I doubt whoever's waiting for that ice ginger back home is so impatient that it can't wait. Mum might not let you come back to town if you annoy her. Oh, 15 minutes, in and out. Gabriela took a single step forward in the bustling market, but hesitated. You're one of them. Do nobles ever come to a town like this? Lord Sebastian hummed. I think not. My Tara might seem a bustling metropolis by local standards, but the nobles from Vinby or the capital would see it as a backwater peasant town. Why do you ask? No reason. Gabriela focused back on the little city. Be right back. Her soft boots sounded thunderous on the worn cobbles, only drowned out by the clomp of a passing horse and the squeak of the cart. Gabrielle thought of the noble on the horse, his piercing, deliberate stare. She shivered, but still smiled as she pulled her hood a little closer. Maybe he was looking at something behind me. I never looked around until after he was gone. That's probably it. The merchant selling ice ginger must have been lonely. Gabriela grinned and made non-committal noises while the vendor prattled on about harvests and what underground bugs work best with which fertilizers before flowing into talking about his neighbor with foot fungus. Maybe seeming in no rush to make change or handing over the fruits. Lord Sebastian's warning buzzed in Gabrielle's mind. She finally snatched the ice ginger from the merchant's hand with a mumbled, thanks, and keep the change. She quickly turned and ran into a solid wall of soft brown wool. Gabriela gasped and hopped back, but a hand clad in supple leather touched her shoulder. Didn't mean to startle you, said the deep voice with a twang like her mother would use when telling a story from the capital. Gabriela looked up at the noble strong jaw and piercing pale gray eyes, no longer on horseback. He half smiled at her, exposing whiter and straighter teeth than she ever imagined. It's like his teeth had no personality. She realized his hand was still on her shoulder and debated how best to remove it. Mama always said to use words first. You didn't startle me, Gabriela said, losing herself in those eyes like moonlight across the... Can I help you? An unseasonably chill wind blew across Gabriela's cheek through the man's hair. He pulled his hand back to brush it back in place. Actually, his smile broadened his face. I think you could. Care to take a walk? Gabriela breathed in, calling the sluggish powers that came to come a little nearer should she get up. I'm in a bit of a hurry. No. He looked genuinely hurt, and Gabriela wanted to change her answer, but Lord Sebastian would be upset, and that would be worse than harming the feelings of a random, very attractive noble. He could be the romantic lead from any of the books in her mother's library, the ones that made her blush. His grin returned, and though her experience reading people was woefully lacking, Gabriela thought this look was genuine. 5 minutes, he said with a wink. 20 years of her mother draining warnings about the people from town, and much more about the nobles from the wider world, went out the proverbial window that evening. They could still make it to the inn tonight with another quick delay. 5 minutes. Glorious. Let's just sit around the corner where it's quiet, he said, sliding his hand around her elbow, gently directing her. She instantly decided she hated the gesture. Two men standing behind him, the blond man that spoke to him earlier on the horse, and perhaps that man's brother, shifted to let the pair pass. Gabrielle pulled the powers of whom nearest. They stepped around the apothecary's shop, and the ambient noise of the market was cutting in. His hand dropped from her elbow as they continued strolling south. As I'm sure you know, the man started, I am Brynmor Higgins, Marquess of Melodis. Gabriela did not know that, but assumed that all nobles introduced themselves with the assumption that you should already know their story, and that giving their names a mere formality. Gabriela, she said, leaving off any exciting titles. Gabriela Marwol. A beautiful name, unusual name. Are you named for your mother, grandmother? No. A woman of few words. I can respect that. Mysterious. Gabriela stopped and turned to Brynmor. I do have somewhere to be. How can I help you, Marquess Higgins? Please, call me Brynmor. Job. He waved at the two men trailing them. I'll meet you at the tavern this evening. The men clearly disapproved of their dismissal, but nodded and turned back toward the market. Brynmor gestured down the narrow alley with a damp cobblestone, shaded by the apartments leaning inward, the 2 or 3 stories high on the side, and they continued their walk. I'll be quick, said Brynmor. My uncle, Duke Rhys Highgate, wishes to include this area in his duchy. My Tara and the surrounding regions stand alone, isolated between Melodis, the sea, and the cloud. He sent me to open a dialogue about such a prospect. The alley opened to steep stairs leading to a lower section of my Tara. Gabriela could see over the roofs below and a sparkling view of the sea beyond. Lord Sebastian was right. By the sun's position, they would have difficulty making it to the inn before the full moonrise, though they didn't really have to make it that far. Gabriela paused at the first step. Why me? You should go to the local queen, or she stopped to remember the titles from her books. The mayor or city council. I thought you might help me with exactly that. Brynmor took his eyes from her to focus on smoothing the front of his wool coat. You see, I'm a complete outsider here. I don't know much about the customs of my Tara. If I come to them with talk of annexation with implied assimilation, they toss me out. I'd return to my uncle a failure. Why do you think I could help? Gabriela kept an eye on the sun, hoping her barely restrained annoyance would help expedite the conversation. I feel a kinship to you, Gabriela. Brynmor's eyes drifted back to meet hers. Not a kinship, a trust. You're an outsider, too. How did I wouldn't ask that you help me with any of the negotiations? Just tell me some of what you first did when you came to my town. Why would you assume I'm not from here? Your clothes are a century outdated, though they fit you quite nicely. Up close, I see your eyes twinkle with an intense mystery, but I first noticed your hair. Despite everyone in the region having such dark and straight hair, your curls are as fresh as pale snow. Or as fresh as pale snow. Pale as fresh snow, my goodness. Brynmor can't talk. He reached a gloved hand to touch a stray lock that lay across her cheek. Gabriela felt her initial interest in the Marquess shrivel up with that inane comparison. A brick smashed into the cobblestone, missing them by a few feet. Brynmor looked down at the brick, then up at the building's roof, with more confusion than worry. Not now, Aura. That only got my initial attention, making you stand out in the crowd, as it were. Then I saw you perform dark magic, he finished. Her heart leapt to her throat. What? No, that's absurd. Brynmor let out another slow chuckle, waggling his fingers over his palm, mimicking what she must have looked like at the apple. The secret is safe with me. Gabriela let out a puff of air. Her mother had been clear about the remaining that she should remain unknown in town, unnoticed. She had to steer the conversation away from that. Why do you want to blend in? You're noble. You go and do what you want. Maybe so, but my uncle has put so much into securing his borders. I want every advantage here. The duchy overlaps the Crystal Wood Gardens, and he's regularly fighting off the dead abominations that rise from there. If his territory included my Tara, he could close up his lines right to the crack. Gabriela turned from him, looking down the 20 steps of hard, flat stone quarried from the cliffs just south of town, much like the rest of the city's construction. Her mother saw little need for Gabriela to know the intricacies of politics, but she knew that a solid front along the crack would soon mean a solid front beyond it. This man's uncle, this duke, would invade her home in time. I can't help you, Brynmor. He stepped in front of her on the edge of the first step. I'll admit, it was moral. I honestly thought you could help with my mission, but also, he pulled his glove from his right hand and traced his knuckles down her cheek. You're beautiful, Gabriela. The power surged and she slapped his hand away. Time seemed to catch in his breath as Brynmor stumbled backward, flailing his arms in the empty space over the steps. Gabriela's fingers briefly reached for the edge of his pristine woolen overcoat, only to close on air. She watched as his horrified face, the piercing gray eyes suddenly vulnerable, fall away from her, tumbling feet over neck, down the steps, each impact punctuated with a crunch. He finished in an awkward pile at the bottom. The power that was no longer sluggish flooded through her. Without thinking, she performed the motions she'd seen her mother perform 100 times.
Okay, that's just so fun. So fun.
Nice.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad that you read the prologue, because you're right. In so many instances, readers skip the prologue, and the prologue can be so important to setting the story. So I'm really glad that you read that. So my question for you about what you read so far is, have you patterned Gabriela after one or more humans you've met upon your life's journey?
It's a good question. I usually always do. I can always find that this character is an amalgamation of X, Y, and Z or whatever. But I guess I didn't honestly think about that with Gabriela. She's naive. This is her first time away from home. She is a very fun-loving character. She always sees the best in people. So yeah, I guess it's an amalgamation of other characters, but I can't really say if it's any particular one or some people from my life. So I guess no.
Okay,
Which is an odd one for me.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. What was your biggest? I always ask this, but because I, as a writer myself, I'm super curious about craft. So I always like to ask, what was your biggest challenge in writing this story? What was the thing about crafting it that made you stop and go, oh, I got to figure out this puzzle?
There were several times when Gabriela came up with some really intelligent idea, and someone else would say something in the scene, and she'd say, that makes me think of something, or that gives me an idea. And then I would have to go for a long walk because I had no idea what that idea was.
A true case of characters taking over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So she did that at least twice. There was another problem that I had with the structure of the book, because I'm a believer of the first in, last out idea. So whatever you introduce first should be the last thing, and then all the sub stories should be resolved. You don't start something third and then finish that last. I kind of finish stuff in the reverse order. So I had a problem of it's like that. So that was chapter 1, and it's maybe about chapter 6 that maybe 4, doesn't matter. The antagonists get introduced, and then more antagonists get introduced, and their stuff ended up being resolved last. And no, Gabriela's the main character, even though one of the antagonists is another point of view character. Her stuff started second, so it can't finish last. So I had a problem of kind of reworking some of the structure and order of things to make. I
find that fascinating that you have this predefined. I mean, I'm a passionate plotter. I love plotting, but I move and stuff around all the time, which is why I like plotting, because outlining gives me the flexibility of moving things. But I find it very interesting that you have a process that says there are rules to how this gets done, because I mean, so many of my writer friends are pantsers and they have no rules. And
Sure. Yeah.
I'm a plotter and I'm flexible with my rules. So I find every time I get to talk to a new author, right? And I get to say, okay, what's your process? I love that everybody does it differently.
We're all different. Yeah. Well, so Great Mistakes was the first book that I plotted the entire thing, every single scene before I actually sat down to draft it, like really hardcore drafting. All the ones before were largely pantsed, and so this is the first one that I've really fully embraced the plotting side of things. There's still,
That's
like
really
with
fun.
Gabriela taking over a scene or Valoria later taking over a scene, and there was the introduction of Lord Sebastian here. He's comic relief, and he takes stuff off the rails all the time. So there is still plenty of room for that creativity and that pantsing, but it still is very useful to follow a plot that you have.
Yeah, I've always believed that, but that's just
Mhm.
me. So thank you so much, Jamie, for coming back on the program.
Thank you
Best
for
of
having me.
luck
Thank
with
you.
the new release. I'm very excited for you and I can't
Thank you.
wait to get it when it comes out. I'm very
Thank you
excited.
so much. Thank you.
Have a great night.
You as well. Thanks.